Hi everyone, in this video we're going to go through a sample budget on Excel to get you familiar with some of the Excel features. So I'm starting here with just a blank workbook. I haven't saved anything or anything like that. And I'm going to first create a title for my spreadsheet just for appearance purposes. I'm going to call this Budget. And because this is a title, I'm going to increase the font size. So I'm selecting the cell, going into my font menu, and I'm going to increase the size and make it bold. This is really just for aesthetic purposes. I'm also going to go ahead and resize this first column so that it's a little wider. So I'm grabbing the right-hand side of the A label there. And then leaving a little space, I'm coming down to row 3. I'm going to make column headings for income, amount, and then expenses and amount. So I have income in my first column and then amount. And then I'm going to leave a space there and do expenses and amount. If you're following along with me, you can, of course, organize this in a different way, but I'm going to make 2 columns for income and for expenses. I'm also going to make these cells bold since they are headings, but I'm not going to change the font size. So under income, I'm just going to put in some different hypothetical sources of income. So I'll have paycheck and tips. Maybe I have some side income from driving. I'll just call it driving. And I'm just going to make up some amounts here. So I'm going to say my paycheck is $2,500 a month, and my tips are $500, and driving I make $200. If you're doing this for a class, you can, of course, make up values or you can estimate your actual income. All right, I'm going to do the same thing for expenses, just come up with some sample categories. So I have rent is $1,700, I have insurance is $200. All right, these are just some sample expenses and amounts. All right, now since all of these amounts are dollars, I'm going to highlight the number values and format these in the currency format. So this will add a dollar sign. It also gives cents to all of the values. If you don't want the cents, you could change the number of decimal places, but I don't mind having the cents in my amount totals. All right, another good way to kind of organize your spreadsheet, especially if you have multiple tables like I have here, is to add some grid lines. So I'm going to highlight my income table, and under the font formatting, there is a little border option. So I'm going to do the drop down on the borders and just do all borders. Another option, if you want, is you can just add a border underneath a certain cell. So instead of doing all borders, I could just highlight the top cells and do a thick line under there. So lots of different ways to kind of just clearly delineate what how your data is organized. So play around with that. And then underneath each one of these tables, I want to total up my income and my expenses. So I'm going to do a label here, total income. And here I'm going to use our first Excel formula. So I'm going to put an equal sign here. You could, of course, type in numbers, like if I do 5 plus 7, it will calculate those. I can also reference individual cells. So if I wanted to just add this cell and this cell, I can do that with addition, and I'm just clicking on those cells to reference them, but you'll see that it shows the name of the cell. So this is column B, cell number 4 is that 2,500 number on the screen. So this also works. That's just adding up those first 2 numbers. In this case, I want to add up a bunch of things, and we have a particular formula for this called the sum. So I'm going to do equals sum. By default, Excel will capitalize the functions, but it doesn't actually matter whether you capitalize or not. So I'm writing sum, and then I do a starting parentheses. And again, you could type individual numbers in here separated by commas, but I'm just going to highlight all the cells that I want. So I'm clicking and dragging, or sort of holding my mouse button down as I highlight all of these cells. And it gives me a range. This is the notation for range, so this shows B4 colon B6. So that's all the values within column B from 4 to 6. I'm going to close my parentheses and press enter. And then this is going to add up those three numbers. I can do the same thing for expenses. So I'm using equal sum, parentheses, and then highlighting the numbers I want to be included. My total expenses is cut off here, so I'm going to resize the column. And the borders are a little bit funky here, so I'm going to fix those. All right, so I cleared the borders from my total and re-added the bottom border from hobbies here. Now off to the side, I'm going to create a label called balance, where I'm going to take my income minus my expenses. So equals, and I don't need a sum function here. I'm just going to do the income number minus the expenses number. So this shows that in this hypothetical scenario, I have $325 left over as my balance. And one of the best things about Excel is that when you use formulas like the sum that we used here, they automatically update as data changes. So if I go in and say, oh, my rent is going up and now it's $1,900 per month, we can watch and see that the total expenses and the balance are both going to change when I change that number. So my total expenses has now gone up, my balance has now gone down. So we can dynamically sum the data using formulas like this. Another thing that's pretty cool that we can use cell references for is to do computations that can be repeated easily. So say I want to look at each of these expenses and figure out what percentage is that of my total expenses. So if I was just going to do one of these calculations, I can use my equal sign to tell Excel that I want to do a calculation, and then take that expense amount divided by the total expense amount. Now you could either type in those numbers, or in this case I've clicked on the cells so that Excel can just reference the cells there. If I calculate this, it's going to give me 0.617886. I could even reformat this as a percentage. So if I go to my number formatting, there's a percentage option, and it converts this to 62%. I could get more decimals if I want to, but 62% is fine for me. But if I do the calculation this way, I have to recalculate for every single one of these values. Instead, I'm double clicking on this cell so I can edit it. You can also, in order to edit, click on a cell and then go to the formula bar up above the cells. And that's another way to edit something that's already put in here. So I'm going to change the cell reference that I'm using here, particularly for the total. I want to be able to reference different expense amounts, but always divide them by the same value of the total. So the way we do that in Excel is by adding dollar signs in front of sort of the name of the cell. So I have E4 divided by $E, $11. Now if I calculate this, it's going to give me the same thing. It's doing the same calculation. But what this allows me to do is to extend this formula down the column. And the way you do that is by, after you've entered the formula, you put your mouse over the bottom right corner. There's a little dot there, and when you put your mouse over it, it turns into a black plus sign. And I'm going to drag this down all the way down the table. So if I look at the formulas that are in each of these boxes now, we see that the first one was doing E4 divided by E11. If I double click on the next one, it's doing E5 divided by E11. The next, oops, stop editing. The next cell is doing E6 divided by E11. So you see that as we've dragged the formula down, each next cell is looking at one down from the previous one. So we started with E5, then E6, then E7, etc., all the way down the table. But because we added dollar signs to the denominator, to that total, it's not changing what number it divides by in the denominator. So this is an easy way, even if we had 100 different categories here, we could easily write one formula and then drag it down to fill in the entire table. Now, just to see what it looks like if I don't do those dollar signs. So without the dollar signs, these are called relative cell references, and they're defined relative to the location of that box. So if I slide this down, drag it down the table, I'm getting some errors here. These are divide by zero errors. If I click on one of these, it's showing me that this is taking E7, which is the cell right next to it, and dividing by not my total from E11, but E14, which is down here. That's because as I dragged this formula down, it's also moving that relative cell reference from the expenses down, which is not what I want. So when I put in the dollar signs for that E11, I'm changing it from a relative cell reference to an absolute cell reference. And I'll redo this calculations. So now I can see what percentage of my total expenses each amount accounts for. Right now my rent is 62% of my expenses, which is probably too much. I have personally used this on my own budget to see what expenses account for the biggest components. I could do the same thing for my income. So I would do equals, I'm just using the cell next to this, the individual amount divided by, and then I can either click on the cell or edit it, or I could just type in its name. The total in my sheet is in B7, so I'll do $B, $7. And when you're editing cells, Excel helpfully color codes them so that we can see what boxes it's using. So this is the percentage of my income that comes from my paycheck. I can drag this down and I'm getting all of these percentages. These ones are still as decimals, so if I want them to show as percentages, I will change their formatting. And now I can see those relative measures of the income amounts. Just like the previous calculations, if I change any of these values, maybe my rent goes back down to $1,700, all of those percentages will also change. So everything is dynamic based on the calculations that you set it up with. One last little bonus that I'll throw in here, just because it's so convenient to visualize, is that we can easily make a pie chart from this information, or a bar chart. So I'm going to look at the expenses. If I just highlight this table of all my expenses and their amounts, I can go to the Insert tab, and there are lots of different types of charts that we can do here. Because this is amounts for different non-numerical categories, I could do a bar chart, which Excel calls a column chart, and this would show a column for each one of those expense amounts, and the height of the column represents the total amount of my expenses. Or I could do a pie chart, which would give a nice visual of the relative expenses. Just hit the ribbon so that I could see this a little bit better. So here we have a pie chart with our different expense amounts visualized in a pie slice. There are lots of different settings for labeling and styling these different charts. So for example, with the pie chart, if I go to the Chart Design tab, I can choose different styles and color schemes. And you can also do things like change the labels and where they're placed, change the legend, all of those kind of things. So that's it for this little introduction exercise. This is Paige Casabona with the Red Rocks Math Department. Thanks for watching.